War is often described as hell. But what unfolded in Nanking, the then capital of China, in the bitter December of 1937, transcended even that grim description. It was a descent into a maelstrom of human depravity, a chilling chapter in history's darkest hours. The air itself seemed to curdle with fear, thick with the premonition of unimaginable horrors. For the citizens of Nanking, life was about to transform into a relentless nightmare, a terrifying landscape painted with the blood of innocents. The world, for the most part, would watch in stunned or worse, indifferent silence as an ancient city was systematically violated. The Japanese Imperial Army, flushed with earlier victories, stood poised at the city's gates. Their arrival was not heralded as a liberation, nor even as a conventional conquest of war. Instead, it marked the beginning of an orgy of violence so extreme, so widespread, that it would forever stain the annals of human conflict. The very fabric of society was about to be torn asunder, leaving behind wounds that for many would never truly heal. This was not merely a battle for territory, it became a gruesome testament to what happens when the restraints of humanity are utterly discarded, when soldiers become predators and civilians their prey. Imagine the biting cold of that December, a cold that seeped into the bones, mirroring the icy dread gripping the hearts of Nanking's populace. The city, once a vibrant center of culture and governance, found itself trapped, a lamb awaiting slaughter. The distant rumble of artillery was a constant, terrifying drumbeat, counting down the moments to an unspeakable fate. Children clung to their mothers, their innocent eyes reflecting a terror they could not comprehend but instinctively felt. Every shadow seemed to harbor a threat, every unfamiliar sound a portent of doom. The normal rhythms of life had ceased, replaced by a singular all-consuming focus, survival. This was Nanking, on the precipice of an abyss. The events that followed were not random acts of wartime chaos. They were a calculated, systematic campaign of terror. The soldiers who marched into the city were not just conquerors, they became tormentors, their actions fueled by a brutal ideology and a chilling disregard for human life. The stories that emerged from those dark weeks are not easy to hear, nor should they be. They speak of a suffering so profound, it demands to be acknowledged, to be remembered, so that such hell on earth may never be repeated. The horror that befell Nanking was not an isolated incident, but a brutal escalation in a wider conflict. The Second Sino-Japanese War had erupted in July 1937, born from Japan's expansionist ambitions in Asia. Japan, a rapidly industrializing nation, sought resources and dominance, viewing China as a key stepping stone. The initial clashes, like the Marco Polo Bridge incident, quickly spiraled into full-scale warfare. The Japanese military machine, modern and well-equipped, advanced with ruthless efficiency against the often outmatched Chinese forces, who fought bravely but were frequently overwhelmed by superior firepower and brutal tactics. Before the shadow fell upon Nanking, the vibrant metropolis of Shanghai had already endured a similar, though perhaps less systematically genocidal ordeal. The Battle of Shanghai, lasting 3 grueling months, was a bloody affair. It showcased the ferocity of the Japanese assault and the desperate, courageous resistance of the Chinese. When Shanghai finally fell in November 1937, the path to Nanking, the nation's capital, lay open. The Japanese forces, embittered by the unexpectedly stiff resistance and casualties at Shanghai, and perhaps encouraged by a high command that seemed to condone brutality, advanced westward with a terrifying momentum, their reputation for cruelty preceding them. Nanking, as the capital of the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek, was more than just a major city. It was a symbol of Chinese sovereignty and resistance. Its capture was a key strategic and psychological objective for the Japanese Imperial Army. They believed that by seizing the capital and inflicting a devastating blow, they could shatter Chinese morale and force a swift surrender, thereby ending the war on their terms. This belief, however, tragically underestimated the resilience of the Chinese people and grossly misjudged the impact their subsequent actions would have on global opinion and historical memory. The march towards Nanking was itself a trail of tears and blood for the Chinese countryside. Villages were looted, civilians were abused, and a palpable sense of dread spread like wildfire. Many civilians, fearing the advancing army, fled their homes, becoming desperate refugees in their own land. Those who remained, or those who sought refuge in Nanking, hoped that the city walls might offer some protection. They could not have fathomed the scale of the barbarity that was about to be unleashed upon them, a barbarity that would leave an indelible scar on the conscience of the world. As the Japanese Imperial Army drew its iron ring tighter around Nanking in early December 1937, a sense of impending doom permeated the ancient city. Nanking was not just any city, it was the heart of the Chinese nationalist government, a place of immense political and cultural significance. Its grand avenues and historic buildings stood as silent witnesses to centuries of dynastic power and more recently, to the aspirations of a modernizing republic. The thought of it falling into enemy hands was a devastating prospect for the Chinese people, a blow to national pride and a symbol of the dire straits the country faced. The Chinese government, under Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, had initially vowed to defend Nanking to the death. However, as the military situation deteriorated rapidly after the fall of Shanghai, a difficult and controversial decision was made. The bulk of the elite Chinese forces and the government itself evacuated the city, relocating further inland to continue the resistance. This left Nanking defended by a largely demoralized and poorly equipped garrison of around 100,000 soldiers, many of whom were inexperienced recruits, under the command of General Tang Shengzhi, who publicly declared he would share the fate of the city. The preparations for defense were frantic but ultimately inadequate against the overwhelming Japanese onslaught. Trenches were dug, barricades erected, and the city gates fortified. Yet, within the city walls, panic began to set in amongst the remaining civilian population, estimated to be around 500,000 to 600,000. Many had fled, but many others, particularly the poor and those who believed the capital would be safe, remained. They were trapped, caught between the advancing enemy and the formidable city walls that would soon become a prison rather than a shield. The air crackled with rumor and fear as stories of Japanese atrocities in other captured areas reached the anxious ears of Nanking's residents. The initial Japanese assault began on December 9th, with heavy artillery bombardment and aerial attacks. The Chinese defenders, despite their disadvantages, put up a stiff resistance in several sectors, fighting with a courage born of desperation. However, the Japanese military machine was relentless. They systematically breached the city's formidable medieval walls, which had stood for centuries, using overwhelming firepower. By December 12th, General Tang Shengzhi, realizing the futility of further resistance and facing the imminent collapse of his lines, ordered a general retreat, an order that tragically descended into chaos and contributed to the disaster that followed. On December 13, 1937, the Japanese Imperial Army poured into Nanking. The city's defenses had crumbled. What followed was not the orderly occupation of a captured capital, but an immediate and horrifying descent into anarchy and savagery. The retreating Chinese soldiers, many of whom had discarded their weapons and uniforms, in a desperate attempt to blend in with the civilian population, became the first targets of Japanese fury. The concept of surrendering prisoners of war, a tenet of international law even then, was utterly disregarded by the invading forces. The streets of Nanking quickly became killing fields. The breakdown of military discipline among the Japanese troops was swift and terrifyingly complete, or perhaps more accurately, the discipline imposed was one of systematic cruelty. Orders, whether explicit or implicit from higher echelons of the Japanese military seemed to encourage, or at the very least permit, the widespread atrocities. Soldiers, seemingly drunk on power and victory, and perhaps desensitized by brutal training and prior combat, roamed the city with impunity. They were transformed into marauding bands, hunting down not just soldiers, but any Chinese man, woman, or child who crossed their path, marking the beginning of 6 weeks of hell. The initial days after Nanking's fall were characterized by mass confusion and terror. Civilians, bewildered and petrified, sought refuge wherever they could, in their homes, in public buildings, or in the hastily established Nanking Safety Zone. But safety was an illusion for most. Japanese soldiers, often in small groups, kicked down doors, dragged people from their hiding places and subjected them to unspeakable acts. The air filled with the sounds of gunfire, screams, and the chilling laughter of perpetrators. The promise of order that a conquering army sometimes brings was replaced by a reign of terror that knew no bounds. This was not just sporadic violence, it was a deliberate effort to break the spirit of the Chinese people, to inflict maximum suffering. The Japanese military seemed determined to make an example of Nanking, to demonstrate the fearsome consequences of resisting their imperial ambitions. The city, once a symbol of Chinese pride, was systematically being turned into a charnel house. The meticulously planned urban landscape with its wide boulevards and government buildings became the stage for a grotesque drama of death and destruction, a spectacle of human cruelty playing out before a largely indifferent world. The 6 weeks following the fall of Nanking are etched into history as a period of almost unimaginable horror, often referred to as the Rape of Nanking. During this time, the Japanese Imperial Army engaged in systematic mass executions of Chinese prisoners of war and male civilians. Tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, of disarmed soldiers and ordinary men were rounded up, marched to the edges of the city or along the banks of the Yangtze River, and then brutally slaughtered. Methods varied: machine gunning, mass bayoneting, beheading, and even live burial. The scale was industrial, the cruelty medieval. These were not heat-of-battle killings. These were cold, calculated exterminations. Eyewitness accounts from survivors and even some Japanese soldiers themselves paint a gruesome picture of these killing fields. Men were tied together in long lines before being mown down by machine guns, their bodies then often set alight or thrown into the river. Some were used for bayonet practice, a horrific training exercise for new recruits. The Japanese military seemed determined to eliminate any potential source of future resistance, and any male of military age was deemed a threat, whether he had been a soldier or not. The sheer number of victims overwhelmed the capacity to bury them, leaving corpses to rot in piles, a ghastly testament to the slaughter. The brutality extended beyond organized massacres. Individual acts of sadism were rampant. Japanese soldiers, seemingly given free rein by their officers, indulged in killing contests, competing to see who could murder the most Chinese. Newspapers in Japan even reported on these contests with a chilling, celebratory tone, detailing how 2 officers vied to be the first to kill 100 people with a sword. This perverse glorification of murder stripped away any veneer of military honor and exposed the depraved mindset that had taken hold within significant portions of the invading army. The streets of Nanking echoed with the cries of the dying and the taunts of their tormentors. Civilians were hunted down like animals, families were torn apart, their members often murdered before each other's eyes, the elderly were shown no mercy, and children were not spared the violence. Stories abound of infants bayoneted, of families forced to commit incestuous acts before being killed. The psychological terror inflicted was as devastating as the physical violence. No one felt safe. Every knock on the door, every shout in Japanese could signal imminent death or torture. Nanking became a city where the living envied the dead, a place where humanity seemed to have been completely extinguished by an overwhelming tide of barbarism. Beyond the mass killings, one of the most horrific aspects of the Nanking massacre was the widespread and systematic rape of Chinese women and girls by Japanese soldiers. It is estimated that tens of thousands of women, from young girls to elderly grandmothers, were subjected to sexual violence. This was not merely a byproduct of war, it was a deliberate tool of terror and subjugation, carried out on an epidemic scale. Rape was used to humiliate not only the women themselves, but also their families and the entire Chinese populace, a brutal assertion of dominance by the conquering army. No woman was safe. Japanese soldiers forcibly entered homes, schools, and even the supposed sanctuary of the Nanking Safety Zone, dragging women away to be gang-raped. Many were raped repeatedly, often by dozens of soldiers, over days or even weeks. Resistance frequently meant death, not just for the woman but often for her family members who tried to protect her. The soldiers displayed a shocking level of cruelty, often mutilating their victims after or during the assaults. Pregnant women were bayoneted in their wombs, and others were forced into sexual slavery, confined in military brothels to serve the unending lust of the troops. The stories recounted by survivors and documented by horrified Western observers are deeply disturbing. They speak of unimaginable suffering and degradation. Young girls were abducted from their parents, wives raped in front of their husbands, and mothers violated before their children. The trauma inflicted was profound and lifelong for those who survived. Many victims were killed after being raped or died from their injuries or subsequent infections. Others took their own lives, unable to bear the shame and horror. The scale of this sexual violence was so vast that it left an indelible scar on the collective memory of Nanking. The Japanese military hierarchy did little to nothing to stop these atrocities. In fact, evidence suggests that the sexual enslavement of women was, in some instances, condoned or even organized. The establishment of comfort stations, military brothels, staffed by forcibly abducted women, became a horrifying institution within the Japanese military. The suffering of these comfort women is a particularly dark chapter of the war. The sheer depravity exhibited by the soldiers in Nanking revealed a terrifying capacity for inhumanity, turning the city into a living hell for its female inhabitants, their bodies becoming battlegrounds in a war of terror. Amidst the overwhelming darkness and brutality that engulfed Nanking, small flickers of courage and compassion emerged, most notably in the form of the Nanking Safety Zone. This demilitarized area, covering about 2.5 square miles within the city, was established through the heroic efforts of a small group of Western expatriates, businessmen, doctors, missionaries, and educators who chose to stay behind after most foreigners had evacuated. They risked their own lives to create a refuge for Chinese civilians, hoping to shield them from the worst of the Japanese army's rampage. It was a desperate gamble for humanity in a city consumed by inhumanity. Led by the German businessman John Rabe, a Siemens representative and, ironically, a Nazi party member, the International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone worked tirelessly. Rabe, using his Nazi insignia and his status as a citizen of a nation then friendly to Japan, repeatedly confronted Japanese soldiers and officers demanding they respect the neutrality of the zone and halt their atrocities. He and other committee members, such as Dr. Robert Wilson, the only surgeon remaining in Nanking, and Minnie Vautrin, an American missionary and educator at Ginling Women's Arts and Science College, documented the horrors they witnessed, hoping to bring global attention to the unfolding tragedy. The safety zone, though vastly overcrowded and undersupplied, managed to provide shelter for an estimated 200,000 to 250,000 Chinese refugees. However, it was not impenetrable. Japanese soldiers frequently violated its boundaries, entering to seize men for execution and women for rape. The Westerners patrolled the zone, often intervening directly to stop assaults, pulling women from the clutches of soldiers, and hiding men targeted for death. Their diaries and letters from this period provide some of the most compelling and horrifying eyewitness accounts of the massacre, filled with raw emotion and righteous indignation at the barbarity they were forced to witness daily. Despite their valiant efforts, the International Committee faced an almost impossible task with limited resources and little to no support from the outside world. The world, preoccupied with the looming threat of war in Europe, or simply unwilling to confront Japan, remained largely silent. News of the atrocities did trickle out, thanks to the reports of journalists like Frank Tillman Durden of the New York Times, but it failed to provoke any significant international intervention. The heroes of the safety zone were a small beacon of light in an ocean of terror, their actions a testament to individual courage in the face of overwhelming evil, but they could not stop the tide of slaughter. After Japan's surrender in 1945, which marked the end of World War II, the world sought to bring to account those responsible for the myriad war crimes committed. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, officially the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, was convened, mirroring the Nuremberg trials in Europe. Several high-ranking Japanese military and political leaders were indicted for their roles in orchestrating or permitting atrocities, including those committed during the Nanking Massacre. General Iwani Matsui, the overall commander of the Japanese forces that captured Nanking, was among those tried, convicted, and subsequently executed for his failure to prevent the rampage. However, for many survivors and observers, the justice meted out was far from comprehensive or satisfactory. Emperor Hirohito, in whose name the war was fought, was controversially granted immunity from prosecution by the American occupation authorities. Many other officers and soldiers directly involved in the killings and rapes in Nanking either evaded justice entirely, received relatively light sentences, or were never even identified. The sheer scale of the atrocities made it impossible to prosecute every perpetrator, and political considerations often overshadowed the pursuit of full accountability. This perceived lack of complete justice has remained a sore point for many Chinese people. Furthermore, the historical narrative of the Nanking Massacre has been a deeply contentious issue, particularly between China and Japan. While the events are extensively documented by eyewitness accounts and photographic evidence, some nationalist and revisionist elements in Japan have persistently sought to deny or downplay the extent of the massacre. They have questioned the death toll, disputed survivor testimonies, and attempted to reframe the events as legitimate military actions, causing immense pain to survivors and straining diplomatic relations. The legacy of Nanking includes not only the memory of the horrific events themselves, but also the ongoing struggle for historical truth and recognition. The failure to achieve full contrition from successive Japanese governments has hindered genuine reconciliation. For the survivors and their descendants, the fight for justice is intertwined with the fight for memory, ensuring that the world does not forget the suffering endured. The quest for a true reckoning continues, a testament to the enduring impact of those 6 weeks of hell. The Rape of Nanking stands as a chilling monument to the depths of human cruelty and the catastrophic consequences of unchecked military aggression and dehumanizing ideologies. The sheer scale of the killings, the systematic use of sexual violence as a weapon of war, and the sadistic pleasure taken by perpetrators paint a picture so horrific it can be difficult to comprehend, yet comprehend it we must. To turn away, to allow the passage of time to dim the memory of Nanking, would be a disservice to the hundreds of thousands of innocent lives lost, and a dangerous betrayal of future generations who need to learn from history's darkest hours. Remembering Nanking is not about perpetuating hatred or assigning collective guilt. It is about acknowledging the truth, however painful, and understanding the conditions that can lead to such atrocities. It is a stark reminder of the fragility of civilization, and the importance of upholding international laws and human rights, especially in times of conflict. The stories of the victims, their suffering, their terror, and their desperate struggles for survival must be kept alive. They serve as a powerful warning against the dangers of nationalism, racism, and the doctrine of might makes right, which fueled the Japanese imperial expansion. The courage of those few foreigners in the Nanking safety zone, like John Rabe and Minnie Vautrin, also offers a vital lesson. In the face of unimaginable horror and official indifference from the wider world, they chose to act, to protect, and to bear witness. Their actions demonstrate that even in the darkest of times, individual conscience and bravery can make a difference, offering a glimmer of hope in humanity. Their testimonies, alongside those of the Chinese survivors, form an invaluable historical record that refutes denial and demands remembrance. We owe it to them to listen to their voices. Ultimately, the legacy of Nanking compels us to vigilance. It reminds us that genocide and mass atrocities are not relics of a distant past, but ever-present threats that can resurface when hatred is allowed to fester, and when the international community fails to act decisively against perpetrators of such crimes. By studying and remembering the horrors of Nanking, we honor the dead. We validate the suffering of the survivors, and we arm ourselves with the knowledge and moral imperative to prevent such a hell on earth from ever happening again. The silence that once allowed Nanking's agony to unfold must be forever broken by our commitment to remember.